At some point, if New Zealand doesn't bite the bullet and say, yeah, we've got to do things differently, then our downwards spiral is just going to continue. It's going to take some bold leadership to get us out of this downward spiral that we're in. And that bold leadership has to involve some honest conversations about tax.
The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. Okay, we are taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and our special guest today was the 41st Prime Minister of New Zealand following the retirement of Jacinda Ardern from politics in January 2023. Unfortunately, at the general election in October that year, Labor lost to National in a pretty heated election campaign. But following the election, he was re-elected as leader of the Labor Party and leader of the opposition. And with the next New Zealand general election only about a year away under his leadership, Labor are now leading National in the polls by 3 or 4 points and are in a genuine contest to win back government in one term. And he joins us on the line from across the ditch. Chris Hipkins, kia ora, and welcome to Socially Democratic.
Kia ora, it's great to talk to you.
As I was saying to you before we were recording, whilst the majority of the people that listen to this show are Australians, but we do have a core group of Kiwi Labor Party people that listen to the show as well. So you're at least talking to some familiar ears on today's episode. But certainly this is a great opportunity to introduce you to a bunch of Labor Party people here in Australia, in particular young Labor people that listen to the show that I think would be interested in going and campaigning for you at next year's general election. So I'm really appreciating you taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the show.
Yeah, great. And look, we always love to see the Aussies coming and visiting us. We had a few of our own team over there for your election campaign and enjoying the celebrations of the election campaign, because let's be frank, it didn't look very flash when the campaign was starting, and it was a pretty incredible result. So I think our people who went over the ditch to take part in that came away feeling very happy with the outcome.
It was a great night, and I think we'll talk a bit about that maybe a bit later in the show as well, in terms of where you're placed at this point, or Labor's placed at this point in time. You're heading into an election year next year. Before we sort of go into some of I'm keen to get a bit of your backstory as well, but just right off the bat, when is the New Zealand Parliament sitting next? Like when are you sitting next?
So we're sitting again next week. Generally, we don't sit during the school holidays. I think it's school holidays over there as well, so we haven't been sitting. I was actually in Australia last week. I took my kids to the Gold Coast and we did the theme parks, and that was all great fun. But we generally sit about 30 weeks of the year in the New Zealand Parliament.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's good. Can you do me a favour? Can you ask, in question time, the government how much of New Zealand taxpayer dollars was spent to bribe the Italian referee to throw the Bledisloe Cup match at Eden Park on Saturday?
Well, I was at that game. I've got to tell you that you Aussies were just completely outplayed. Good on the All Blacks.
I mean, I know you're desperate to protect that win streak at Eden Park, but bribery, really? Is that necessary? You were nervous. Eden Park has never been that quiet before.
The All Blacks were just, after their shocker a fortnight ago, I think everybody was feeling very relieved to see the All Blacks back on their game on Saturday. So they are the best rugby team in the world.
Well, I think the South Africans might have something to say about that. But yeah, it was a great contest. It's a shame the referee decided to stick his nose in it and keep on giving penalties, guys, when they weren't really there. But sure, we'll see what happens in Perth this weekend. Glad to see you were supporting News on Rugby, though. I don't think anyone that listens to this show, apart from Michael Cooney, follows the Wallabies. But anyway, I appreciate you having a chat to me about rugby on the show. Okay, let's talk a bit about your background, because most of Australian listeners probably won't know too much about you. Your origin story. How did you where'd you grow up, and sort of what were the things that fermented your own politics that led you to eventually standing for the Labor Party?
I grew up here in the Hutt Valley, where I still live. I grew up in a relatively working class part of the Hutt Valley, and pretty aware that a lot of what we tell ourselves about hard work and rewards for hard work isn't true for a lot of families. So, this idea that if you just work hard, you'll be able to get ahead, life's full of opportunities and everything will be all right, isn't true for a lot of the kids who I grew up alongside. They don't have access to the same opportunities that I was lucky to have access to. And that is part of what drove me into politics, because, I think that there are a lot of people out there working damn hard who aren't able to create a better life for themselves. And that's not fair. And so, I've always had a real sense of social justice and fairness. And, that's what attracted me to the Labor Party. But I guess, some of it is also just circumstance and things that happen. I started my time at university not hugely politically active, and then took part in a protest against increasing student fees, where we marched from the university down to Parliament, and the Speaker of the House decided he didn't particularly like us making noise on the forecourt of Parliament and issued a trespass order against us. And I felt at the time that was a bit of an injustice, because if you can't go and protest, on the front steps of Parliament, where can you protest? I mean, surely that's the place that you go to protest. And so, we were arrested and ended up going through the court system. And by the time that court case was resolved, I think it was about 12, 13 years later, the court case finally got resolved. I was a member of Parliament by then, because it got me engaged in the political process and aware that, you can make a difference if you get active and you get involved.
So when you went to university, did you consider yourself as a Labor person at that time, or was there things that happened at university that sort of led you down that path to identifying Labor as the political party of your flavour?
I can't say I was hugely attuned to politics up until I went to university. I mean, I guess if you'd asked me as a school leaver, where would I sit on the political spectrum, it certainly would have been on the left of the political spectrum, but I can't say I had a strong political alignment. I'd helped a little bit in the 1996 election campaign for Labor, which was my last year of secondary school, but only the absolute margins. And it was really kind of going to university, getting involved in politics at university that piqued my interest in politics, and I got more involved in the Labor Party after that.
So, I mean, it's a weird thing, really. No one, I think, for so many of us that may have there might be some sort of political fire in the belly, even as a high school student. You never sit down with your careers advisor and they never say to you, Chris or Stephen, there's a pathway for you in politics. They never give that advice to you. You kind of have to find that yourself. So then you got involved in student politics at Victoria University. How do you then find those next pathways into being involved in the Labor Party? I mean, obviously join the Labor Party to start, right? But I mean, it's even then, it's kind of a bit of a weird place to kind of find your way, right?
One of my observations about secondary school kids and political activism is you get more political activism in the sort of more middle class to wealthier secondary school student population than you do in the low income areas. I think a lot of those low income families are just sort of moving from one day to the next. And I went to a relatively low income secondary school where politics was just not something that really was talked about. It just wasn't really a thing. So it was only when I got to kind of more middle class university that I became more aware of politics. And I have to confess, I got lucky along the way. I've been, having finished university, I was involved in student politics on campus. Then having finished university, went off and worked in the private sector for a period of time. and became aware that there was a job going working for the new, what was relatively new, Helen Clark Labor government in Parliament in Wellington. And so I applied for that. It was working for my then local MP, who was the Minister of Education at the time, Trevor Mallard. And he very generously gave me a job as a political advisor. And I learned a heck of a lot about politics in the 3 years that I was doing that job. And, that really kind of got me, I guess, onto the political treadmill. I went away from it for a bit, did my OE, and was coming home to New Zealand and was speculating with another friend of mine who was in London about the forthcoming election. So this was by then was 2008, we're talking now. And we were sort of looking at that from afar over in London, thinking it wasn't looking that great for the New Zealand Labour Party at that point. And we were sort of speculating that maybe there'd be some retirements ahead of the election. Turns out there were quite a few retirements ahead of the election. And we were wondering whether, either of our, because he was also someone with a close connection to the Hutt Valley, whether either of our local Labour MPs would be retiring, Trevor Mallard or Paul Swain. And literally while I was flying home from London, Paul Swain announced that he was retiring. And I had made a throwaway comment, if either of them retire, I'll have a go. I'll see if I can win the nomination. And I thought, a bet's a bet, a deal's a deal. So I put my name forward for the nomination for Rumataka, not really with high hopes of winning the nomination, but I worked hard and I won the nomination, and then a year later I won the seat, and that was 2008. And so I came into Parliament off the back of an election loss. So while I just narrowly won my seat, Labour had just lost, and we spent the next 9 miserable years in opposition. So that was my introduction to parliamentary politics, was 9 years of opposition. I'm not keen to repeat that.
No, it's something I've reflected on here in Australia as well. I think the Australian Labor Party activists, one thing that unites all of us, I know we're a big, broad church, and we certainly have our moments where we can't agree, but one thing we can agree on is we hate losing. And we'd rather be in government than not be in government. Just going back to the Helen Clark era, just talk about the sort of the legacy that government had on New Zealand Labor, but in particular you said, I learned a lot of lessons in that time. What were some of the things that you learned whilst you worked in that government?
Well, working for Trevor Mallard, who had a bit of a reputation as a hard man of politics, he was one of the Labor Party's attack dogs and was not afraid to really get weighed into the political debate. But that wasn't actually what I learned most from him. What I learned most from him was his skills as a minister, because he took the view that the worst form of decision you can take as a minister is not to make a decision. And if you make a decision and you get it wrong, you can go back and fix that. But if you just don't make decisions because you're not willing to make a call to go one way or the other, then actually that's really the worst thing that you can do. You need to keep things moving. And that is your job as a minister. Things land on your desk because someone ultimately needs to make a decision. And if you're not willing to make a decision, well, the decision just doesn't get made. So when many years later, when I became a minister myself, I took the view that my job there was to make decisions. And, you collect the evidence, you weigh up the evidence, you listen to the arguments, you try and be as open as you can to people's representations. But then your job is to make decisions. And I actually think the best politicians are the ones who know that that's their job. The ones who are scared to make decisions are the ones generally who don't achieve very much. So when I look at the people who are most successful in that government, one of the people who will always be an enormous inspiration to me was the Minister of Finance for that 9 years, Michael Cullen, because he was willing to do big things. He introduced Working for Families, which is a series of tax rebates that targeted tax cuts to people with families. Introduced KiwiSaver, which is still not quite where the Australian superannuation savings are at, but it was a very big step along the way to that. Introduced the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, which effectively is a sovereign wealth fund, without which we would be in a lot more difficulty today than we are. Removed interest on student loans, which was huge for hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders with student loans. Did some, big, bold calls like renationalising the rail system, which had previously been privatised. So he was a politician with a good sense of his values, was actually quite fiscally conservative, but was willing to make big, bold calls when that was called for. And so I think that's the legacy that government leaves behind is, many of the things that are keeping us out of being a complete basket case now were things that were bequeathed to us by that government.
And so you mentioned that you went into the parliament at the beginning of what would be 9 barren years. You're in opposition now. Reflecting on your time in opposition at the moment and looking back to that formative experience as a politician when you went into parliament the first time around, what lessons did you learn in those 9 years that you've sort of said as leader of the party, we can't repeat now because we don't want to do this 9 years or more of opposition again?
I think there's two great tensions that I think all centre-left sort of Labour parties around the world will face. We're all very idealistic people, but in order to win, you do have to compromise and you do have to move to where the electorate is. Then the electorate's not always going to start out where you want it to be. You can get it to where you want it to be through a series of changes and over time, but that's not always going to be your starting point. So one of my lessons from that 9 years in opposition is you have to start where people are now, not where you wish they were. And that will mean compromise along the way. You can move people a long way, but you have to bring them with you. You can't just drag them to you. They've got other options in a democracy. They can vote for the parties that are closer to where they are now. And that's always a tension for a party full of idealists, and Labour parties tend to be full of idealists, and that's one of our strengths, I think. But you do have to focus on, where are the voters that we need to get to vote for us who don't currently vote for us? Where are they now? What are they feeling now? What are they thinking now? What's important to them now? And you need to make sure that that's where you are, because then you can move them from those places. But if you're not where they are, you're not going to be able to move them. So I think that's the first big tension. The second is, particularly when you're in opposition and you have a lot more time and you don't have the day-to-day consequences of governing the country to worry about, personalities become more problematic. People will spend more time arguing with each other rather than arguing with the government or arguing with the electorate. And I've been very, very conscious that Labour's path to re-election at the next election involves us staying unified as a team, focusing on the government, not ourselves, and making sure that we're connecting with the electorate. If we start fighting with each other, we will have no chance of winning the next election. And our team has been so resolved in that regard. It's the most cohesive opposition that I have ever been part of. And, I spent 9 years in opposition before. This team went into opposition knowing that we could win again in 3 years, but we have to do everything right. And I tell you, our team is committed to doing that.
It's an interest. I'm fascinated in that second response. The makeup of the caucus now, how many of them were from that era of being out of government in 2009? Is there a balance of new blood and folks that do, like yourself, that remember that experience? Is that part of, are there older heads in the caucus room going, look, we've been there before and we don't want to go back there, to sort of say to those newer MPs, look, this is an experience we want to avoid? Is that part of the story that's happening in that caucus room?
There's actually only a handful of us still left. When I look across the parliament, there's only actually about 10 MPs out of the parliament of 122 that have been there as long or longer than me. Huge politics is a pretty high turnover profession, often not by choice. People get retired by the voters. But I think everybody can see what happened to us last time, even if they weren't part of it, and doesn't want that to happen again. There are a number of people who are in our senior lineup now who became ministers relatively late in the piece, who just were kind of cutting their teeth and really getting into it, and really, really want to have another go at it. And I actually think that will make us a very strong government, because I think the most effective ministers, in my view, are often ones who have had a period of time as ministers, have then had a period of time in opposition where they have to reflect and they go out and they reconnect with the communities and they come up with new ideas. And then they go back into government knowing exactly what to expect. and knowing how to get things done. And so I think that will make us a very effective government next time around, because people won't just be coming in all new, having to learn the job of being a minister. They've had a bit of a go at it before.
Let's. I certainly want to spend more time talking about getting ready for the election next year. But if we can go back a bit, let's go back to January 2023. Jacinda Ardern, the then Prime Minister, has just announced her resignation. Talk us through your experience of that time in the caucus. Like, did you know it was coming, or was it a surprise? How did the caucus respond in that moment?
Well, if I go back to the end of 2022, Parliament had just finished for the year. I think the press gallery had its Christmas party, which is always the big, final send-off for the year. And Jacinda said, can you pop up to Premier House? I just want to do some sort of planning for next year. And I thought, yep, sure, no problem. And she said, it'll just be you, me, Grant, and Raj, who was her chief of staff. And I thought, this is kind of interesting. And I just had an inkling, that something was up. And so we went up there and we had a bit of a chat. And she said, look, I just don't think I've got this in me anymore. I'm going to think about it over the Christmas holidays, but in all likelihood, I'll probably stand down. And I kind of fully expected at that point that Grant would say, and I'm ready to go, and and that's what will happen. And then Grant he spoke next and he says, and I don't really want to do it. and I, at that point, that was probably the surprise part of it for me. I mean, I worked very closely with Jacinda over the COVID period. I knew what a toll that had taken on her, and I knew that she had been thinking about how long she wanted to be in politics for a while. So that probably wasn't as surprising as Grant's decision that he too sort of saw that his shelf life was starting to draw to a close. And so, I had conversations with him over the summer, and I had the summer holidays to think about it myself. And I'd urged him to think about it too, because if he wasn't going to do it, I wanted to know that he really was certain that he wasn't going to do it.
Yeah. And
so I got phone calls from both of them sort of mid-January saying that they'd both firmed up their views that, Jacinda was going to stand down and Grant didn't want to do that either. I had said to Grant, well, if I'm going to put my name forward for it, it's on the condition that you have to stick around for a while longer. I can't just take this whole thing over without that. And so he agreed that he would stay for, potentially another term, but at least the first part of the next term had we won.
Yeah.
And so I went into it on that basis and put my name forward to be the leader when Jacinda made her announcement. And there's that natural flurry of activity where everybody sort of is a bit surprised. Everybody looks around the room and thinks, can I do it, or should I do it, or and so you go through that process. But it became clear within a period of sort of 24, 48 hours that I had the overwhelming support of the Labor team, and in the end it was a unanimous decision by the Labor caucus. There was no other candidate.
Culturally, I'm wondering how different that is to the Australian Labor Party experience. In Australia, people hit the phones pretty hard and quickly, and it's kind of the theory of speed kills, right? I'm always told by your colleagues in New Zealand that New Zealand is a softer, gentler party than the Australian Labor Party. But what did those 24 hours look like for you in terms of seeking out support from your colleagues? Is it a lot of coffees and phone calls, or how does this play out?
Well, it was kind of a bizarre situation because we were in Napier, which is on the east coast of the North Island. That's where we'd started our first caucus meeting for the year. It was a very short caucus meeting in the end because Jacinda announced that she was leaving, and that was kind of the end of the meeting. And so everybody was busy travelling back to whichever part of the country they live in. And, in the sort of 24 hours afterwards, there were a lot of phone calls, a lot of people catching up with each other and people going for long walks along the waterfront just while they sort of thought through all the different permutations. And it was actually a phone call that I got as I boarded the plane. I was on the plane to fly back to Wellington, and they just closed the plane door, and they're telling you must turn off your phones now. And I got a message basically from effectively by that point the only other person who might have potentially been a candidate saying, can you give me a call? And of course I couldn't. which was somewhat frustrating because I then had to sit for the next hour on the plane, not able to return the phone call. But then just as I was switching my phone to flight mode, I got a message from another person saying that the reason for that phone call was that person was ringing me to say that they weren't going to put their name forward for it. So while I couldn't return the phone call, I sat there with the sort of realization over the course of that hour-long flight that I was about to become the Prime Minister. And that was quite a moment.
At 35,000 feet. And what did go through your mind in that hour of isolation in an aircraft above New Zealand?
A lot of excitement, a degree of, I wouldn't say I was overwhelmed, but certainly a degree of realism about the challenge ahead. Labor had a really rough end to 2022. We were trailing well behind National in the polls, and it was going to be a narrow road to victory for us in 2023 to win. We had to get a lot of things right. We had to not have any distractions. And, of course, that's not how things panned out. But I was pretty resolved that we were going to do it, that we could win if we did get everything right. And so I sort of started to mentally make a list of all the things that I needed to do in the next couple of weeks in order to achieve that. And for the first few months, we actually did pretty well. We leapt back into the lead in the polls. There was a degree of optimism that we could win. And it was only really sort of the winter. The winter really hurt us. That cost of living crunch really, really hurt us. And we had a few things internally go wrong for us. And then, we went into the campaign not where we needed to be, compounded by the fact that in the second last week of the campaign, I got COVID and ended up spending a week in a hotel room when really I wanted to be out there on the campaign trail.
I forgot about that. That's right. I've always had this theory that, and this is not helpful for you in the time, but when things are going well, things always go well. When the brakes are just breaking your way, like you're doing all the things that you need to do anyway that you can control, that means it's a good campaign. And then all of a sudden, other things that you can't control also break for you. But when things aren't going well for you, it's the complete opposite. And I remember when that happened, I thought to myself, that is a killer at the time. I mean, how do you respond in that moment?
We sort of, across the 6 years we were in government, there were many days where it felt like far out, which curveball's coming at us next, from a volcanic eruption, a terrorist attack, severe weather events, flooding in Auckland, a cyclone. We had, then of course, the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic was just every day you woke up having to deal with something new that just seemed completely bizarre. And by the end of it, there was, it's fair to say that there were a lot of people who were feeling pretty overwhelmed by all of that. And, some of them had already indicated that they were leaving. So it did feel like going into that campaign, I think that the game was very much stacked against us. And having said that, you never ever give up. And I never accepted that we were going to lose until the day of the election, because as soon as you accept you're going to lose, that has an impact on how you get out there in your campaign. So right up to the day of the election, I continued to wake up every morning at 5:30, 6 o'clock and go out there like we were going to win. Because if you don't do that, then you won't.
Unlike the political system in the United States, particularly certainly with the president or governors where they have term limits, the Westminster system can throw up some quirks in which a prime minister or a leader can be replaced without going to the people and having an election. So it creates this kind of this continuity versus change experience for the person replacing the predecessor. How did you seek to get that balance, or how did you approach that as someone replacing someone, but without going to the polls? Like, in terms of the continuity of the government, but also you're your own leader. You want to set your own tone. How did you manage to do that?
It was very difficult. And New Zealand voters have a history of being pretty sceptical of governments changing leaders partway through a parliamentary term. No prime minister has taken over midway through a term since the Second World War and gone on to win an election in New Zealand. Every leader that's taken over, which regardless of whether it's Labor or National, if they've taken over midway through a term, they've lost the next election. Kiwis tend to like the idea that they get to choose the prime minister, not the parties. And it's a double whammy too, because I found during my brief 8.5 glorious months as Prime Minister that I did feel an obligation to honour the commitments that Jacinda Ardern had made in 2020. And they weren't necessarily commitments that I would have made, but that was the platform that we were elected on. And as someone who had taken over midway through the term, I didn't think that I had a mandate from the people to say, actually, we're going to change all of that. And so that did have an influence on the sort of platform that we went into the 2023 election campaign on. And our platform in 2026 will be quite different. I will have had 3 years as leader of the opposition to work with the party and with the spokespeople that we have to make sure that we're campaigning on the sort of platform that I want to campaign on, and that the commitments that we're making are ones that I know that I want to be in there delivering on.
So that's a good segue into this current term. What have you done differently under your leadership to set yourselves up to be in this position now that you are, in the published polls anyway, you're 3 or 4 points ahead of national, which, I don't want to say historically because you're the history of your own sort of election cycles, but broadly speaking, in a Western liberal democracy, first term governments tend to get the benefit of the doubt regardless of what's going on. But the sense that I'm getting from afar is that this government is struggling. What have you and your team done to put yourself in this position, do you think, to start with?
The current government are incredibly unpopular, and with good reason. They're making a heck of a mess of things. They were pretty shaky right from the beginning with, the coalition, the nature of the coalition that they've established. But we have also done things well. We've stayed strong and cohesive as a team. We've put real pressure on them in terms of highlighting where they're getting things wrong. And one of the things that we've been criticised by the political establishment for is actually one of the things I think the public are resonating with, which is that we haven't just rushed out there and come up with a whole lot of new policy ideas straight away. We've taken the time to go out and listen to people about why they didn't vote for us. What were the things that we did last time that they liked? What were the things that we did last time which were out of step with what their expectations were? And that means that when we do start to announce policies next year, as we head into the election campaign, I think that will position us well. I think one of the worst things you can do as a newly defeated opposition is say, well, look, everything we did was perfect and we just want to campaign on doing everything the same next time around, because if people have just rejected you on that platform, they're not going to turn around and say, oh, well, we were wrong. So you have to give them something different if you want to get them back.
Absolutely. Rule number one in politics, the voters are always right. It's something the Greens over here haven't learned because they're still blaming the voters for why they lost 4 seats at the last federal election. What I'm interested in what you just said there before, that you've gone out and listened to the electorate and they've told you the things that they thought the previous government had done well, but also the things that you probably got wrong. What are those things? What are the things that they've said to you did well, but also where do they want to see change from you?
If you look at the things that really hurt us before the last election and during that election campaign, the cost of living was huge. And while voters didn't necessarily blame us completely for the causes of the cost of living crisis, I think they found our proposed solutions to it inadequate. And I think that's a fair criticism. The COVID-19 exit from elimination, we had an elimination strategy in New Zealand, and the exit from elimination to life as normal with a border reopened and COVID circulating in the community was pretty damn bumpy. We managed the pandemic very, very well up until that point, but that was where things got a bit ropey. And so there's a little bit, particularly in Auckland, because Auckland was the epicenter of our COVID response because it's where everyone was coming and going from the country. And so there was a lot there. And then we also saw post-lockdown a real spike in crime. And it was not unique to New Zealand. It happened in many other places around the world. But they saw our response to that as being quite inadequate as well. And in fairness, I think there were some things that we were very slow to respond to. So we went through a different kind of epidemic, actually, of young kids stealing cars and ram raiding businesses. And that got really out of hand. And it got out of hand really quickly. And we were too slow to respond to that. Jacinda, partway through her last year as Prime Minister, decided to make me the Minister of Police because I think she realised that we needed to do something more decisive in that space. And we had started to get on top of that by the election, but the legacy of it, was still there, and it was still pretty raw for people because it's pretty confronting. I went and met with a lot of the businesses that have been affected by it, and think about a dairy, for example, corner store. In some cases, it's not just the business; it's that person's home. Their family lives in the flat out the back or up the top or whatever, and having someone drive a car through the front of your shop is just about as invasive as something can get. So I understand, and we lost a lot of support from that community, and I understand why that was. So those would be the top three in terms of the feedback that we got. I think people were broadly supportive of what we were doing in the environment space. They were very supportive of a lot of things we were doing in health and education, and a lot of the social policy that we were doing. But they felt that we, on those big three issues of crime, the exit from COVID-19, elimination strategy, and the cost of living, we didn't get those things right in the minds of a lot of the voting public.
So it's, when New Zealanders go to vote in over 12 months' time, or, at some stage next year, there's going to be a bit of daylight between then and coming out of the COVID pandemic. What do you think the main issues the campaign will be fought on going into late 2026, or maybe more specifically, what issues do you want to campaign on that you think that will resonate with the electorate?
I've set out our major priorities, which are jobs, health, and homes. When I took over from Jacinda, I said that I think the Labor Party needs to get back to its core DNA, and in our DNA, jobs has got to be the top of our list. It's what the Labor Party was founded on, the idea that everyone deserves the dignity of a good, well-paid job where you're treated well and you've got good working conditions and you've got some security that comes from that.
Yeah.
The Kiwi dream of owning your own home is something that we also need to get back to. More and more New Zealanders aren't able to buy their own homes anymore because we've stopped viewing houses as homes and instead started treating them as investments, and fewer people are able to stump up the cash for that investment. And so more and more people are not being able to own their own homes. And healthcare is absolutely essential. If you don't have a quality public health system that allows you to, prevent avoidable illness and keep people in good shape so that they can fully participate in the economy and in society, then that's a big problem. So jobs, health and homes are right at the core of what our next government will be about. And a lot of what we offer in terms of policy will be around those things. And other things linked to that. Climate change, for example. Well, climate change is a huge opportunity for good, well-paid jobs. There's some really exciting opportunities for New Zealand given our abundance of renewable energy resources and so on. And then I think the campaign will undoubtedly have cost of living at the centre of it again, because the current government came in and said, we're going to fix everything. It's all very easy. The last government just got it all wrong. And, we're business people. We know our numbers and we're going to make everything better. And they've made everything much, much worse. And as a result, I think that cost of living will undoubtedly be a very topical issue again.
Stepping back a bit and looking more broadly at New Zealand as an economy and its place in the world, like how do you, if you were to become Prime Minister again, how do you envisage, structurally the New Zealand economy for it to grow and to be, stronger? I get a sense when I'm in New Zealand that a lot of families are talking about that their kids are coming over to Australia for work. You can't, the economy can't work if you keep on losing the people that are going to invest in it, right? I just want to get a sense of what's the bigger picture in terms of strengthening the New Zealand economy?
If you look at the two biggest drivers of people leaving New Zealand and moving to Australia, they're around jobs and houses. So, they want to get a good, well-paid job and they want to be able to buy their own home, and they don't see the opportunity to do that in New Zealand. They can get a better paid job in Australia that gives them more chance of being able to buy their own house and live a more financially secure life. And if we don't want them to be leaving for Australia, then we've got to fix those two things, which again highlights why I've put jobs and homes as two of our top three issues heading into the election campaign and for the next term of government. We've got to get those basics right if we want to hold people in New Zealand. terms of how we do that, I think the current government's message is we're waiting for big, rich overseas foreigners to come in and save us. Actually, we've got a lot of capital in New Zealand. Hundreds of billions of New Zealand dollars in capital get invested outside the country. We can invest more in ourselves. We can back ourselves more here in New Zealand and create huge opportunities for us. I think what we have to do as a country, though, is pick the areas where we can win. And, we have some huge advantages around renewable energy. We've got some huge advantages around sustainable food production. And we've got to really focus in on saying, well, where are the areas where, as a country, when we look on the world stage, where are the areas that New Zealand can win? And what more do we need to do to set ourselves up for success?
I listened to a podcast that you were on, it must have been a couple of months ago. This year's gone like a flash, so it may have been at the start of the year, but it was a long-form podcast on New Zealand radio, and you got asked the question about tax and capital gains tax and wealth tax. And I know that internally the party's having a conversation about that, and everyone's sort of looking to you and the team about what you're going to say on taxation. And I'm not seeking to get you to make an announcement on the show now, but I just want to get a sense of, it's. I spoke about this story on the pod a couple of months ago, so I'm not going to repeat it. But it basically was Peter Mandelson when he came out to Australia, when Keating was Prime Minister in about 96, and Tony Blair was running in leading up to the 97 election. And Keating had basically said to Mandelson, "Tell Tony Blair, do not talk about tax going into the election; it'll kill you." Because they were thinking about doing some stuff on tax. And so obviously for Labor folks around the world, it's kind of like, it's almost like the third rail of politics. Let's not talk about tax heading into an election campaign. But obviously it is you're a policy person more than I am. I'm just a campaigner, but structurally it's an interesting way of changing the makeup of the economy, right? What's going on in your mind in terms of the caucus about talking about how do you deal with tax heading into this election campaign next year?
Tax is a really difficult issue for the centre-left around the world because the centre-right have spent the last 4 decades convincing everyone that tax is a form of punishment rather than a form of collective contribution to our wider well-being and our wider, success as human beings. And that's what we're up against. The reality is all governments need tax. Otherwise, you don't have a democracy, you don't have public services, you don't have shared assets, you don't have good roads, you don't have, an education system that works for everyone, you don't have access to healthcare and so on. So tax is a reality. You do need to raise money to pay for all of those things. And in New Zealand, we've been so narrow in our discussions around tax that we rely on personal income tax for the vast bulk of government revenue. Then we have GST, and then we have corporate tax. And beyond that, that's pretty much it. There are other minor revenue sources for government, but that's pretty much where the government gets the vast bulk of its income from. And that makes us a bit of an international outlier because most other countries will have a more diversified tax take than that, whether it's through, dare I say it in the US context, tariffs or sort of capital gains taxes or whatever. Most other governments that we would compare ourselves with would have a broader tax base than New Zealand does. And I think there is a realisation of that in New Zealand. It's always a difficult issue. No one likes the idea of paying more tax. So what we have to do is go into the election campaign with a clear sense of what we want to change, how we want to change it, and it has to be very digestible for people. I'm very mindful of the Australian Labor Party's experience with the unlosable election that they lost when Scott Morrison ended up being re-elected and Bill Shorten didn't. And I'm aware of the role that tax and levies and fees and so on played in that campaign. So we've got to be very careful here. But if New Zealand doesn't bite the bullet and say, yeah, we've got to do things differently, then our downward spiral is just going to continue. It's going to take some bold leadership to get us out of this downward spiral that we're in. And that bold leadership has to involve some honest conversations about tax.
It's interesting you mentioned that the 2019 Australian election. In the post-election analysis, there was a view that the Labor opposition failed to point out to the electorate the existing problem of taxation in the country before they then came up with solutions around franking credits and around what was the other one? That's my brain's broken. Housing. What's it called? Negative gearing. Negative gearing around homes. So we came out with this massive policy, but everyone was like, well, why do we need to do this? I don't understand what the problem is in the first place. I mean, is there a robust conversation happening in New Zealand right now in which it can make it not easier, but for folks to understand, I get why the government would want to maybe change the tax base now?
It's something that, the Labor Party around the world is sometimes guilty of. We solve problems for people before we let them know that they have a problem in the first place. And we first campaigned on capital gains tax in 2011 when no one else was talking about capital gains tax. People didn't realise that this was an issue. But I think now, 15 years on, there has been a lot more mature conversation in New Zealand about it. We put capital gains tax as one of the options back on the table after the last election, but we haven't narrowed down and sort of announced what we're going to do. And as a result, a lot of other people have been talking about it. The IMF, the credit ratings agencies, the banks, the bank economists, they've all been talking about that. And as a result, I think that's really helped because it means that New Zealanders kind of get now that, we do need to change some things around tax.
I'm interested in if you have any reflections on the recent federal election here in Australia earlier in the year. There are some similarities, albeit for a different team. I know that a lot of people around the world have been looking at the Australian example of, why did Labor win so well in May this year, and trying to examine what did Labor do to have such a resounding victory. But I'm also interested in asking folks, well, you should also take a look at what the coalition did and didn't do, because they were leading going into, the start of 2020, start of this year, 2025. It had been a challenging term for the Albanese government. But then Labor kind of got their shit together early in 2025, set the tone. And I think the coalition just assumed that they could just sort of walk into winning government at the election, and that wasn't the case. There are eerie similarities right now in terms of the polls for you guys, right? So maybe not looking at what Labor did, but looking at what the coalition did and didn't do. I mean, have you had a chance to sort of take a look at the way that the Dutton opposition handled themselves heading into that election when they probably thought it was going to be a slam dunk?
Absolutely. We can always learn from each other, and I think we should always learn from past election results here and across the Tasman in Australia. So, of course, I've looked closely at the 2019 campaign, what worked and what didn't for Labor over there, and of course we've looked at the recent campaign where the Liberals went into it as the favourite and didn't win. I think our strategy is very much focused on capturing the lessons from both of those campaigns. One of the reasons that I've been very keen to keep our powder dry on policy is a lot can change in 12 months. And, you don't want to end up wedding yourselves to policy positions that you then can't stick with when you get into the campaign. So we've been very focused on convincing New Zealanders of the need to change the government, because there is that first-term inertia. It's unusual for first-term governments to be defeated, and we're trying to do that. And so focusing in on why them being re-elected would be a disaster has been our focus up to this point, rather than setting out our own stall, because a lot can change in 12 months. And so we'll do that next year as we get closer to the election. And, we're going to have to overcome some past cynicism as well. We've got to make sure that people know that what we're promising them is achievable and it's realistic, and that we've done our homework. They're going to want to know that the problems, the things they don't like about this government are just going to be repeated by the next government, albeit with a different shade. So we've got a lot of work to do. But if we go into the next campaign assuming that we can just ride this out and we'll win by default, we will lose. We're going to have to work hard to win.
Are you finding that you're getting pressure from the political commentariat to start to stump up what your alternate solutions are? Going back to that podcast that you did a couple of months ago, the journalist there was really trying to press you on your announcements, and I could notice you saying, look, that will all come in good time. And I remember when Daniel Andrews tried to do what you're trying to do and get back into government after one term, also very historic to happen here in my home state of Victoria, a year out from the elections. So, in 2013, he spent most of the time just pointing out to the electorate what was wrong with the current government. And then in the final year, he then said, okay, here are the things that we're going to do. They'll make your lives better. Are you finding a lot of pressure there? And maybe within your own caucus, are people saying, oh, Chris, can we just drop a couple of announcements here and there? Or are you is the team focused on, no, this is the strategy and this is how we're going to play it out?
The team's actually been very, very unified about this. I think everybody sees the value in the strategy that we've adopted. So it's a collective strategy. It's not just my strategy. We've gone through it as a team. And I think everybody also knows that now's not the time for us to be, to be leading forward on a whole lot of policy areas when so much can change in 12 months. The government's got a whole nother budget to get through. And goodness only knows what they're going to decide in the next year's budget, that could really kind of change the playing field for the next election campaign. So, the team is very, very, very committed to running a winning campaign. And that means making sure that the policies that we put up are the ones that are going to help us to win the election.
Last question. Before that, a lot of Australians wouldn't be aware of this. So am I right in assuming that at the start of the election year, there is a bit of a custom or a tradition that the Prime Minister of the day would make an announcement at some point in January where they will declare when the election will happen? Do you expect that your opposite number will do that this January?
It's going to be very interesting. So John Key started that tradition back in 2011. And the reason for that was that New Zealand was hosting the Rugby World Cup in 2011. And when you looked on the calendar, there were only so many weekends available in which a general election could be held because of the Rugby World Cup soaking up all the elections. And so he announced it at the beginning of the year. And actually it worked really well. And as a result, Prime Ministers since then have continued to announce it at the beginning of the year. In 2020, when we were in coalition with New Zealand First, Winston Peters was vehemently opposed to the Prime Minister announcing the election date at the beginning of the year, but Jacinda Ardern did it anyway. The question will be whether Christopher Luxon has enough sway within his own team to announce the election date earlier in the year, or whether the people like Winston Peters who think you should hold on to the very last minute to announce have their way. I think it's actually better if you just get the date out of the way. Everybody can then just get on with it. You know what you're working towards.
Yeah. Last question. I've been told when I was over in New Zealand earlier in the month that you're quite the handyman, like genuinely, like not just tokenistic, like you are good with the tools. That's what I've heard, that you're quite good at, doing stuff around the house, foundations, retaining walls, you name it, you're the guy.
Yeah, it's what I do in my spare time. I don't have any spare time, but it is what I like to do to sort of relax. So I'm in a very fortunate position to have a holiday home on the coast, and sandy soils are great to build retaining walls in because it's easy to dig. So I've got a fairly epic retaining wall project happening up there. And then here at home, I like to make furniture. So a lot of the furniture in the house, the table and chairs behind me isn't, but the cabinet behind me, the black cabinet under the telly that you see behind me, nice. I made that. I like to make them from scratch. So it's good fun.
So have you thought about doing some sort of working that into the campaign for campaign content, like a sort of like doing self-help YouTube videos with like a political message? And I've got a concept for you, for Chris, for you to work out. Maybe it's something like, you look to the camera and go, oh, kia ora, Chippy here. Just applying some sealant on the deck to get ready for summer to make sure it's nice and protected. Speaking of protection, your job, that's what we want to protect. And that's why if you elect me, we're going to make, underpayment of wages a crime, something like that, just to work in the, and meanwhile, now I'm going to show you how to lay a sealant on the deck, something like that. That's, that's what the kids want these days, a bit of mix, political message and a bit of self-help.
I quite like that idea, actually. I'm just looking at the deck out the window there, and it does need to be restained over the summer holiday. So you might see that idea come to fruition in the next few months.
No worries. And I don't want any commission. All right? That's for free. That one's for free. Chris, It's great to talk to you. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your hectic schedule to come on the show and have a bit of a chat with us. Best of luck with the next 12 months in the campaign. It's so fantastic to see Labor leading in the polls, and both the work of you and the team putting yourselves in the position that you're in with a chance, and that's all you need. So we want to wish you the best of luck. And to any young Labor kids listening to the show, you need to go over to New Zealand and help out in the campaign. New Zealand campaigns are a heap of fun. I've done a couple, and they're great fun. And there are cousins over there; they'll look after you, and you'll get a good feed and have a good time and win some votes for Labor at the same time. So, Chris, best of luck, and thanks for joining us on the show today.
Good as gold. Great to talk to you, and all the best of luck to you guys over there as well.
Thanks. Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like the show, then join our Patreon community for early and ad-free access to each episode. We regularly take questions and comments from our Patreon members, so get in there if you want to have your say. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.